So we need to talk about a huge case that the Supreme Court will now hear oral arguments in next Monday, and this could completely reshape the Fourth Amendment and, its protections in this current digital age. This case asks a very simple but extremely important and dangerous question. Can the government use a single warrant to identify every person in a location all at once, even if they have no idea who a suspect actually is? Because that's exactly what happened here in this case. The Supreme Court will now hear arguments next Monday, and this case impacts all of us and our private information in this growing digital age. So let's break down what is happening with this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You could also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is 1st Phorm. You guys know that 1st Phorm's an amazing company. They support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel, but also they have amazing supplements. So if you want to check them out, you can do so using the link down below. And if you order using that link, you can get a free 5-pack of protein sticks. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a critical Fourth Amendment case that will now be argued in front of the Supreme Court next Monday. This case involves the Fourth Amendment's rights in a digital age, and if we as users of these certain products have given up our rights simply by using those services. This case specifically centers on something called a geofence warrant. Now, here's what this means in plain English. Instead of investigating a specific suspect, law enforcement has the ability to go to a company like Google and say, give us all the data for everyone who was maybe in a certain area or a certain location during this time period. And that's exactly what happened in this case, which is now up for Supreme Court review, called US versus Chatry. Police were investigating a bank robbery, but were unable to identify who committed the crime, and they did not have any leads. So they decided to go directly to Google and requested location data for every device and every person within a 150-meter, area and time period as well within this crime. The initial search actually pulled in a pool of completely unknown individuals, and then this is essentially what happened. The law enforcement decided to narrow that pool of individuals that they got from Google kind of step by step by requesting additional information from the company. Eventually, by gathering more and more data and information, law enforcement was able to identify one person, the individual here in this case. And based on that whole process and information and data that they got from Google, he was then convicted of the robbery. Now, the issue in this case isn't necessarily about the crime or the individual. Instead, it's about Fourth Amendment rights and law enforcement gathering digital information based on this overgeneralized warrant that they can request from a company like Google. According to the petition, this process required Google to effectively scan through massive amounts of user data to identify devices in that area. We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of accounts were being searched indirectly just to generate that initial list of phones and people within that area. And that's why this case has raised alarm bells across multiple lower courts, because this starts to look a lot less like a traditional warrant and a lot more like a general digital warrant that can be issued to a company. And the lower courts are all over the place on this very issue. The Fourth Circuit in this case ultimately upheld the conviction, but they did so in a fractured decision with essentially multiple opinions, varying on the constitutionality of this process. The Fourth Circuit thought that this geofencing process was in fact a violation of the Fourth Amendment, but they eventually ruled against excluding the evidence that was gathered based on a different Fourth Amendment principle called the good faith exception. Now, the good faith exception is a legal doctrine allowing evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment rights to essentially be admitted into the trial if law enforcement acted with a reasonable good faith belief that their actions were lawful. So the Fourth Circuit here believed that the geofencing warrant was unconstitutional, but they allowed that evidence in just based on the good faith exception. Now, at the same time, other courts like the Fifth Circuit have gone the exact opposite direction and said that these kinds of warrants are unconstitutional. So now you have some direct conflicts as well, and that's exactly why the Supreme Court has decided to step in on this issue. The Supreme Court will now hear arguments in this case on Monday, April 27th, so just next week. Now, the issue that the Supreme Court took for review and will rule on in this case is whether the use of geofence warrants violate the Fourth Amendment. And that means that the court will not be deciding this whole exclusionary rule principle that was allowed by the Fourth Circuit, the good faith exception, or what happens with this specific individual in the conviction. This case is focused on one thing: is this type of surveillance constitutional at all? This case is not just about one crime or this one issue here. It's about what rights we all have because we use services like Google and other companies. And it's about whether the government can identify everyone at a protest, everyone at a church, everyone at a political event, anyone even near potentially a crime scene, and pull all that data based on a generalized warrant. At its core, the court is deciding between two very different views of the Constitution. Now, the first view is really the government's position in this case, which is this is just business records. People voluntarily share their data with companies like Google, so there is no Fourth Amendment problem at all, and there are no Fourth Amendment protections for that type of information. Now, the second view is, that this is mass surveillance, that the government is searching for everyone first and then figuring out probable cause after the fact based on the information that they gather. So now as we get closer to the Monday arguments, here are some key things that we're going to be watching for during those arguments. First, we want to listen for phrases like generalized warrants or general warrants. During those arguments, if multiple Supreme Court justices use that type of language, that is a huge warning sign for the government that they potentially may lose. Second, you want to watch for how the justices talk about everyone versus a specific, suspect warrant. That distinction may likely decide this case as well. The court will be asking, is this a warrant targeted at a specific individual or a warrant, targeting simply everyone? Also listen for discussion on whether geofence warrants constitute searches under the Fourth Amendment. Lower courts are also deeply split and divided on that issue. And third, listen for references to another Supreme Court case called Carpenter versus the United States. Now, in that Carpenter case, the Supreme Court said that you can't track someone's movements over time without a warrant, even if that data is held by a third party. The defense is going to argue that geofence warrants are even more invasive than the Carpenter case and issue because instead of tracking one person, they capture data and information for everyone within a location. So the biggest takeaway right now is that this case has the potential to become one of the most important digital privacy cases and Fourth Amendment issues since we've seen in Carpenter, and this will impact a lot of potential searches and warrants going forward in the Fourth Amendment sphere, especially when we're talking about new digital information and the expansion of this type of technology. And unlike most cases, in my opinion, this is not going to break cleanly along, liberal and progressive and conservative lines of Supreme Court justices. This is going to come down to, how do these different justices actually view things like technology, privacy, and limits of government powers. So now all eyes will be on the Supreme Court and those arguments on Monday, because what happens in that courtroom could really determine how far the government can go in tracking your movements and, really track our information without us ever even knowing. Also, it will help to shape the Fourth Amendment in this digital age where we all use technology and services on a daily basis. And the question becomes, does the Supreme Court believe we have essentially voided our Fourth Amendment rights just because we opted into using these services? So now we will find out how the Supreme Court views that type of issue. So as we get more information, as it develops more during those oral arguments, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of that helps to fuel the algorithm. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.